This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 452nd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Just in time for all the Christmas busyness to kick into gear, I finished up the second of my first draft edits on Dreambreaker. And the really good news is that I'm, as ever, a ding-dong with numbers. You may remember a few weeks ago, I was lamenting that I only managed to trim 8,000 words off the first edit. Well, I miscounted along the way. Turns out I actually did meet my goal of cutting 20,000 words. So, Merry Christmas to me. This means the book now weighs in a svelte Santa Clausian weight of about 198,000. I'd still love it if I could whack some more off, but realistically that's probably not going to happen. So I'm just super happy to get this little darling in under 200,000 words. It's still the longest book I've written, but as I always say, a book's gotta do what a book's gotta do. I'll be taking a couple weeks off from the podcast due to Christmas craziness. There will still be posts on the blog though, every Monday, so be sure to stop by. And by the next time we talk, I hope to have finished my third proofreading-centric edit and be ready to start in on the outline for the third and final book in the series. So, Merry Christmas, everyone, and I hope you enjoy today's topic, my top reads from 2018. As we close out another year of reading, I find myself with a renewed appreciation and vigor for the importance and the blessing of reading. Having devoured books at the hungry pace of 100 plus a year for at least 15 years, I didn't start keeping track until 2002, I've been feeling increasingly uncomfortable and even disturbed by the fact that my reading has fallen off to less than 50 books in the last couple of years. This year, a year of big personal changes in my exterior world, was a year in which I struggled with the desire to even just sit down with a book. There was so much I wanted to read, but whenever it came down to it, I had a hard time doing it. Cue inner panic. Thanks to a Scribd subscription, I ended up listening to lots of audiobooks this year, which saw me safely through, and with 3 more books to my name than last year's total. As I now close out the year, having settled in after a big move, I ecstatically find myself returning to a reading space for the first time in several years. Part of this for me was realizing and coming to peace with the fact that I will probably never reproduce my previous decade of information inhalation. I'm incredibly glad to get to carry the fruits of that decade with me for the rest of my life, but I'm no longer in a place where I'm seeking that kind of prolificacy just for the sake of prolificacy. I'm learning, in no small part due to some of the books I'll mention later in this episode, to focus on turning my reading back into a joyous pastime rather than just another thing to triumphantly check off my to-do list. One thing I've done is to change up my reading routine to make it more flexible within my daily schedule, sprinkling a chapter of this book and a chapter of that book here and there, while devoting evening reading solely to whatever is completely holding my attention, which happens to be William Goldman's hilarious Adventures in the Screen Trade at the moment. So all in all, I count this one of my best reading years, more for how it's ending than for how it actually went. That said, despite my struggles with reading this year, I find that it was a year rich with some incredible books, mostly the nonfiction, ones that I dare say will stick with me for the rest of my life. So today I'm going to share with you my top books of 2018. 5 fiction books, 5 writing books, and 5 general nonfiction books. But first, the stats. My total number of books read this year was 48. My fiction to nonfiction ratio was 26 fiction to 22 nonfiction. My male to female author ratio was 27 male to 21 female. And my top 5 genres were romance with 8 books, fantasy with 6, history with 6, writing how-to with 6, and self-development with 5. And the number of books per rating, the 5 stars, there were 4 books. For 4 stars, we had 18 books. For 3 stars, we had 18 books. For 2 stars, we had 8 books. And for 1 star, we had 0 books. First of all, let's talk about my top 5 fiction books. Honestly, it wasn't a great fiction year for me, which you may remember is what inspired last week's episode, the 10-step checklist to writing an above average novel. I didn't read anything that ranked higher than 4 stars out of 5, but the following are my favorites of the bunch and are all solid and worth reading. Book number 1, The Commodore by Patrick O'Brian, read December 3rd. Rated 4 stars. It is hard to overestimate my adoration for Patrick O'Brian's unique, endearing, intelligent, and humorous Aubrey Maturin series about the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, which was brilliantly adapted into what is also one of my all-time favorite movies, Peter Weir's Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. The latter books, this is the 17th installment, don't have quite the same sharpness as the earlier installments, but this episode is as charming as ever, although featuring one of O'Brian's more rambling and anticlimactic plots. Book number 2, The Last Wish by, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher his name, but I'm going to say that it's Andrei Sapkowski, which I read on July 28th and rated 4 stars. I got a lot of enjoyment out of this series of connected short stories set in an epic fantasy world. The protagonist is a great character, the settings well realized, and the action interesting. It's the same old, and yet totally not. I did listen to this on audio, and the narrator was excellent. Book number 3, The Last Convertible by Anton Myrer, which I read on March 6th and rated 4 stars. This one isn't as razor sharp as Myrer's War Critique Once an Eagle, which was my number 1 book in 2016, but it's still an interesting look at both the World War II generation and the progression of life from idealistic youth to realistic middle age. It just barely avoids being soapy in places, but is always enjoyable. Book number 4, Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, which I read on June 1st and rated 4 stars. So after taking a break from the classics for about 6 months this year, this was my first foray back. After all that time away, it was surprisingly comforting to be once again surrounded by the lush reliability of excellent storytelling and powerful wordcraft. This is a book well deserving of its acclaim, a societal critique that remains pertinent and thought-provoking even today. And book number 5, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which I read on August 9th and rated 4 stars. This book is rightfully a classic. Presented in hyper-realistic details, it is a gripping and chilling account. It lacks something in the way of character or really plot, but it's still fantastic. And here are my top 5 writing books. So in contrast to my somewhat ho-hum experience with fiction this year, my experience with nonfiction was fantastic. This is particularly true of writing craft books, which account for all of my 5-star ratings this year. I've decided to divide the writing craft books into their own category, so I can also share some of my non-writing favorites, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, here is the best of my reading year. Book number 1, Walking on Water by Madeleine L'Engle, read on July 18th and rated 5 stars. This book is an intuitive artist's dream, incredibly beautiful, insightful, and inspiring. I listened to it on audio the first time around, but before I was even halfway done, I ordered a hardcover so I could reread it and underline it liberally. I'm currently working my way through it again bit by bit and enjoying it even more, if that's possible, the second time around. And I'm sure this is the first of many rereadings. Book number 2, Light the Dark, edited by Joe Fassler, which I read on January 1st and rated 5 stars. Usually I avoid anthologies. Too often they are uneven and random. This one, however, is an incredibly special exception. Let me explain this with an anecdote. Instead of highlighting passages I enjoyed, I sometimes used BookDart bookmarks. Well, by the time I finished this book, I only had about 4 BookDarts left in the tin. There is just so much to love in this book. We get to hear from so many great authors commenting not so much on the process of writing, but on the life of artistic pursuit, their own inspirations and influences, and their discoveries about what it means to write. The range of perspectives is vast, so it's interesting to see where they contradict each other and where, in some instances, they agree with each other almost word for word. I was deeply inspired by this book, which was evidenced by the mini podcasts it prompted, either directly or indirectly. Most notably, the episode The Words That Changed Your Life, Discovering What Made You a Writer, and 4 Possible Reasons Why We Write. Book number 3, Book Girl by Sarah Clarkson, which I read on October 30th and rated 5 stars. Sarah Clarkson speaks to me. In both of the books I've read from her, it's like someone has looked into my head and described my experiences with a greater emotional understanding than I had for myself. In both instances, her books came to me at opportune moments when my life was in flux, with me standing at a crossroads of some sort. I read this one after my significant move this year, and as I mentioned earlier, after several years of struggling with the motivation to read. Her ode to words and stories and her loving lists of great books, so many of which I've already read, has reinvigorated the reader in me. I don't think it's too much to say that her first book, Caught Up in a Story, changed my life. This one did too. Book number 4, The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr, which I read on August 9th and rated 5 stars. Another reviewer of this book said that she wanted to underline every word. I felt the same, but since I was listening on audio, I promptly bought a copy so I could do just that. Even if you're a novelist and not a memoirist, as I am, this is a brilliant book full of spot-on advice and one of the best and most applicable challenges to story integrity that I've ever heard. Book number 5, Nabokov's Favorite Word is Mauve by Ben Blatt, which I read on June 6th and rated 4.5 stars. This book offers entertaining and fascinating stats that provide an insightful kind of behind-the-scenes look at what makes great books and authors tick. And now my top 5 general nonfiction. Book number 1, The Road Back to You, An Enneagram Journey to Self-Discovery by Ian Morgan Cron and Suzanne Stabile, which I read on April 14th and rated 4.5 stars. This book provides sound basics of the Enneagram personality typing system. It helped me find my own number, 3 Wing 4, and opened my eyes to areas of personal understanding and growth I hadn't previously considered. Originally, I only gave this and the following book, which we'll talk about in a second, a 4-star rating. But in hindsight, I realized these books have stuck with me more strongly and provided many more life-changing insights than some of the books I initially liked more. Book number 2, Personality Types, Using the Enneagram for Self-Discovery by Don Richard Riso, which I read on July 10th and rated 4.5 stars. This book provides excellent in-depth information on the Enneagram system. There's tons of good stuff here, although I did feel it placed too much emphasis on a descent into psychosis rather than a rise to health. However, thanks to its handy organization, I feel this book is a particularly good aid for writers creating characters, which I talked about in the episode 5 Ways to Use the Enneagram to Write Better Characters. Book number 3, A World Lit Only by Fire by William Manchester, which I read on November 20th and rated 4.5 stars. This book is insightful and entertaining at every turn. It is a great and thought-provoking overview of the Renaissance period. Book number 4, 12 Christian Beliefs That Can Drive You Crazy by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, which I read on May 29th and rated 4.5 stars. This is the perfect follow-up to the author's life-changing book Boundaries, which was my top nonfiction book in 2017. It offers excellent advice that busts through a lot of beliefs many of us, regardless our worldview, take for granted. And book number 5, The Crusades by Zoe Oldenburg, which I read on April 5th and rated 4 stars. I read this book long ago and far away when researching my medieval novel, Behold the Dawn. Upon rereading it, I found it deeply engaging and interesting in some places, while dry and too reliant on a confusing blur of names in others. Overall, it is still one of the best books I've ever read on the subject and entirely enjoyable in its own right. And I have to give an honorable mention to Savage Continent, Europe in the Aftermath of World War II by Keith Lowe. This is an incredibly insightful overview of the post-World War II horrors most of us tend to overlook. It's difficult to read at times, but extremely important. So, what were your top books of 2018? How many books did you read? If you'd like to be a part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again in a few weeks.